I'm kind of thinking about morality, not very effectively I have to say, but I'm trying to think about it again, and particularly about the limitations that are placed on our morality by the fact that we are, just because of the fact of our embodiment really. You know, I'm assuming that our sense of self, our ego if you like, is based around the fact that we have a body that we have historically needed to really take good care of and feel ownership of and not get damaged, and all of the kinds of pleasures and pains which describe that ego and which again have evolved to motivate us in terms of preserving the body and ensuring that it at least gets to reproductive age before it croaks. And even this, much vaunted consciousness and the thinking stuff that we do does seem to have been a product of that process of maintaining bodily integrity. But we are at a point, it seems to me, where we're starting to think, hang on a second, this is such a good idea. The maintaining one's own body is always, to a certain extent, about defensiveness against other human beings historically, but also against the predations of animals, and if not the predations of animals, then the predations of bacteria. And of course, I think people might well draw the line and say, well, we shouldn't really give a shit about bacteria, and I would have to agree with that. But in some ways it's a bit of an arbitrary line, and the fact that we're drawing lines means we're drawing moral lines. It just causes problems, I suppose. So, and it seems to me a lot of the difficulties around morality is because we are necessarily focused on the human being as the kind of atom that's at play in this system. That's the unit we have to work around, because that's where the pleasures and pains lie. So I'm just doing a sci-fi speculation about what kind of things would we have to do to make that different? What kind of an alternative could we offer? I'm just kind of imagining, what would it be like if we were able to somehow switch off certain aspects of our somatosensory systems and kind of reprogram the emotional correlates of that, so we weren't so concerned about that, and perhaps reprogram to focus on other structures, perhaps social structures, perhaps interpersonal structures, transpersonal structures, so that we started to identify less with our bodies, those repositories of pleasures and pains, and started to identify with transpersonal existence in some way. I know there's no meaningful way of doing that, but just for the imagination's sake, we'd have to accept the fact, first off, that bodies would die in really unpleasant ways. If you turn off your pain receptors, and people sometimes are occasionally, come up through this fence, people are occasionally born without pain receptors, or without the ability to cognitively process and recognise pain, and they always have very short lives, and superficially, at least from the outside, quite unpleasant lives. Typically they lose their fingers quite early because they don't have the pain response you would need to take your finger off a hot plate, or to not put your finger in the car door when you slam it, that kind of thing. So they typically lose lots of their fingers. They're always full of cuts and bruises because they do stupid, dangerous things, because they haven't got any of the warning signals, the pain-based warning signals that stop them. So if we were going to abandon individual, ego-centered being in favour of something else, we'd have to accept a life like that. We'd have to accept that most of our people died young and without fingers and with lots of cuts and bruises, which is fine. To say otherwise, it would be a value judgment that's outside the terms of what I'm talking about. So, and ultimately just an aesthetic judgment, since there isn't any pain in that world. So it wouldn't look very pretty, but I guess we get used to that. We'd probably have to find different ways of organising pleasure, because there's no point in just taking pain away. You have to take pleasure away, otherwise people would overly focus on the flesh of the individual body if that's where the pleasures lay. So you'd forget the beauty of a sunset, and forget the smile of a child, and forget the forget sexual rapture, forget those kind of things. Those would have to be scrapped in favour of something much more robotic and automatic. So those things would have to go. So we'd be more like cells. Cells don't have any of those things going on. They just age and die routinely. So we'd be like cells, but then you have to replace that with something else. So you'd have to find some kind of transpersonal being that, maybe it could have those senses built in. Maybe it could have pleasure and pain. Maybe it could have civil rights. I'm just reminded here about Professor Anton talking yesterday about how in American law corporations have been granted some of the same rights as individuals. That might be part of that project in a sense. It'd be a shame if it was just corporations, but they are undoubtedly transpersonal things, objects, entities perhaps. Yeah, and then you'd have to find a way to find a way of identifying. Actually, I'm not even sure if you'd need to find a way to identifying with them. Maybe identification is just too naff, really. Maybe we don't need that anymore. Maybe we can just let this corporate transpersonal entity get on with it, really, and just take pain and pleasure out of the system entirely. Would it really be such a loss? Most of evolutionary history has been spent, and history without animals, life before us, has been spent without pleasure and pain. It's only very, very recently that those, actually even with pleasure and pain it's even more recent, because pleasure and pain are the human feelings is the human experience of emotional responses. So it demands a certain kind of consciousness to even have pleasure and pain. So you can have a central nervous system that doesn't have pleasure and pain attached to it. So most of animal history and human history has not known pleasure and pain, and it's only very recently those came on the scene. So should we really care about them? Would it be better off if we dispensed with those things? Became all kind of cold and sterile and Data and Mr. Spock about the whole thing. And just accepted, that we would wander around in a world that's for the people with no fingers. I don't know, maybe. It's a hard one to take. It's so part of our... with such an affection for that. We've got such an attachment to those things. I'm reminded of that scene in The Day the Earth Stood Still, the remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still. Not a good film, but there's a scene in it where some guy who's an alien who's been on Earth for 60 years or so just talks really lovingly about how awful it is to be human, about how we have these passions and we have these pleasures and we have these desperate pains, but isn't it beautiful? I don't know, maybe it's not. Maybe we should accept that this weird blip in the history of the universe, which contained pleasure and pain, but it is only a small blip in the great scheme of things. Enjoy it while you can, but I guess don't mourn it when it goes would be my response.